Excited for today. Let me add a spotlight to our special guest, CRC's own Dr. Flora Cassen. Cassen, how do I say your last name properly?
Am I unmuted?
You're good. We hear you.
Yeah,
Cassen,
Cassen.
good. Who is both a wonderful member of the CRC community, part of the visioning board, and has been a part of all sorts of the initiatives that are happening at CRC, but is here today because she is a professor of, in particular, Jewish history over at WashU. So after services last week, she came up to me and said, I think there's a paper I've been working on that you might be interested in. And I came right home. It was on Shabbos and sat down and just devoured it. It was so incredibly fascinating. It's a review, at least as I understand it, of the newest literature, the newest studies out looking at the Ashkenazi genome, and in particular looking at the Ashkenazi genome of Ashkenazi Jews who lived about 1,000 years ago, rather than just contemporary Ashkenazi Jews. And your work in there really helped to reframe my understanding of where Ashkenazi Jews may have come from, what our origins are. And of course, this is all inseparable right now in our political moment, from questions of Jewish legitimacy, from questions of whiteness and race, from questions of Israel and nationalism. So it's so exciting to have you with us. And I thought if you're up for it, we'd start just by having you review a little bit of what this paper that you've been working on is, and then I have all sorts of questions for you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for, reading it so quickly. I mean, I got an email Saturday afternoon being like, oh, can you come? So thank you for that. So basically, I've been studying European Jewish history in the medieval and early modern periods. And I was sort of, for a number of years, keeping an eye on all these genetic studies that were coming out about Ashkenazi Jews. And I was always confused because it didn't exactly match what we knew from texts, right? We knew that Jews arrived in Northwestern Europe sometime in the late 10th century, but those studies were saying that all Ashkenazi Jews descend from 350 Jews or something in Poland in the 1400s. And so, I sort of didn't know really what to do with that. And so it sort of, I kept a sort of side eye on it, but never really delved into it until 2 years ago. That article came out about 6 bodies that were discovered, I think when people were building a parking lot in Norwich in England, and they discovered this old well, and at the bottom of the well there were 6 bodies, and they didn't know who these people were. There was a suspicion that they could have been Jews because we knew from texts that I think during the Third Crusade there had been a pogrom in Norwich, and Jews had been attacked and murdered. And it turned out that after they did DNA analysis on those ancient remains, they found that they very much looked like they had DNA that very much resembled that of Ashkenazi Jews today. And a few months later, another study came out on, I think, a cemetery in Erfurt in Germany, where I think they were able to do DNA analysis on 30-some bodies from that time. And there too, they found that they resembled the DNA of Ashkenazi Jews living today. But again, but that was more intriguing because it showed that there were probably 2 or more different groups genetically within the people who lived in Erfurt, and some had DNA like Ashkenazi Jews, but also from that resembled the DNA of people from Southern Europe, and others from people from Western Europe, others from people from Turkey, from Eastern Europe. And so it showed a kind of mixture of people that was unexpected. But in both cases, what was also interesting was that it showed that the specific markers that today indicate Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry were there not just 350 years ago or 500 years ago, but already 700, 800, maybe 1,000 years ago. And so I started reading up on that, and I came across this book, I don't know if you can see, by David Reich, Who We Are and Who We Are and How We Got Here. And he's a scientist at Harvard who works on these issues and has been a sort of pioneer in developing the methods for analyzing ancient DNAs. And that's when I understood that, in fact, there had been recently a revolution in historical DNA studies, because until 2012, all those historical DNA studies, if you sent your DNA to 23andMe or anything that came out, was always based on DNA from populations today. So they went to people, and people who identified as Ashkenazi Jews, and they sequenced their genomes, and they found, oh, these are the characteristics. And then they projected that onto the past. But in 2012, for the first time, a scientist in Sweden was able to sequence ancient DNA. He sequenced the DNA of Neanderthals. And that completely changed, because after that, people started looking at ancient remains, for example, from Europe, and they found traces from groups that populated Europe 12, 15,000 years ago that we didn't know about. And sort of that ability to look at DNA from the past to do history, in fact, is reshaping completely the way scientists, and I think increasingly historians too, are understanding human history. And so that's what I became interested in, because I realized this is really changing how we can think about those DNA studies. And in fact, it is much more consistent with the methods that historians use, because we don't write history based on information from the present, right? We go to archives, we look at documents from the past. And so the ability to look at ancient DNA holds enormous promise to understand missing pieces of human history and missing pieces of Jewish history. And it turns out that we don't exactly know where Ashkenazi Jews come from. And so those studies that are coming out were particularly interesting to me. And then that's why I decided to write that article.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. Would you mind sharing a little bit about where traditionally we have imagined Ashkenazi populations came from, how they ended up in the Ashkenaz, and maybe some of the ways that these genetic analyses are starting to challenge that?
Yeah, so Ashkenazi Jews are a little bit of a mystery, because there are no Jews in Northwestern Europe until the 10th century or something like that. So there are Jews, in Southern Europe, in the Mediterranean basin, all around, right, in North Africa, in Southern Europe, but we don't really have Jews who live in Northern Europe. And around the 10th, 11th century, there's a lot of documentation that these Jewish communities appear, and they're oftentimes invited by local rulers who very much want those Jews to move to their towns. They see them as people with maybe special expertise in commerce, and that would benefit that would benefit their towns. And so we have a number of different charters issued by princes and barons and sometimes bishops, and many of them invite those Jews to move to their towns, but they don't tell us where they came from. So that's part of the question there. And sometime in the 13th century, a Jewish author called Eleazar of Worms, who is one of the leading families of early what came to be called as early Ashkenaz, right? The people who lived in Germany, Western France, called like early Ashkenazi Jewry. And he writes that his family is the Kalonymus family. It's one of the leading families in that region. And he says, my family came from Italy and was invited by Charlemagne to move to Germany, so the Emperor Charlemagne. And he says, and before they were in Italy, they were in Babylonia, and they learned the Talmud, and they learned Jewish wisdom and Jewish texts directly from the sages in Babylonia. And that's very interesting and shows us that there was a need at that point to kind of create an origin story, right? And which tells us something interesting about them. And so what they're telling us they weren't from here, but they were invited by the emperor himself. And in fact, they deserve their leading position within the Jewish community because they were invited by the emperor and because they brought knowledge directly from the Babylonian sages, right there where the Talmud was written. And so for a long time, that's what people thought happened. That and that kind of conforms with that traditional Jewish understanding of themselves that, right, all Jews at some point lived in the Holy Land. They were exiled by the Romans, and then they spread all over the world. But even though they spread, they stayed together in communities, they intermarried. And so, right, something of that original Jewish group from the Middle East is always present in all those different Jewish groups from all over the world. And at some point, people started to question whether that's exactly right for Ashkenazi Jews too. Are they really a group that came from the Middle East, or did they maybe come from Eastern Europe or from Northern Europe? And so there's two alternative theories. And interestingly, right, both theories date back to the 19th, early 20th century, where also there were a lot of, racial questions about Jews. And one is that Jews are actually, European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, actually are mostly European, right? There were some Jews who went to Europe after the exile, but there was also early on in Christian Jewish history an intense competition for converts. And that started in the Roman Empire and that continued after the Roman Empire. And from that large population of converts, that's where European and then by extension Ashkenazi Jews come from. There's not that much evidence, textual evidence for that, but I think for people who are trying to say Jews are European, it made a lot of sense. And then another theory is the Khazar theory, right? Because there's that story of the Khazar kingdom that converted in the 9th, 10th century, somewhere in the Caucasus. And so that was a theory that was actually initially came from a Russian Jew who felt that, why are all these, Western European Jews, why are they seen as the creators of European Judaism? Actually, we are here in Eastern Europe, right? Yiddish and Ashkenazi culture came from here. And in fact, most Ashkenazi Jews descend from the Khazars. There's another interesting element that I think led people to try and find all those theories is that between the 17th or 18th and the 20th century, there's kind of a population explosion among Ashkenazi Jewry, right? They go from, I don't know the numbers by heart, but maybe 1 million in the 17th century to something like 7 million, right, in the beginning of the 20th century. And so that nobody quite understand how, right, that Ashkenazi Jewish population exploded like that. I think they grew at a higher rate than the surrounding population in Eastern Europe. And so there was also a sense that maybe, it had to come from mixing. But at the same time, in the middle of the 20th century, when people started looking at, when we became able to study DNA, modern DNA studies also showed a kind of surprising uniformity among Ashkenazi Jews. And so we have all these questions going around. And what ancient DNA is sort of starting to show, as opposed to the sort of right, theory that all Jews came from the Middle East and they always stay the same and always intermarried and so on, they're starting to show that actually, right, there were many different groups even among Ashkenazi Jewry, and that Ashkenazi Jewry in the past was in a way genetically more diverse than Ashkenazi Jews are today, which is interesting, and a result that surprised everyone who's been in that field for decades. So that's one change. The whiteboard is there. Am I still on?
I am not sure why this whiteboard just popped up. There we go.
Okay.
It's gone now. Sorry about that.
And so, yeah, so it's showing a greater diversity and a sense that maybe, right, those early DNA studies that were based on the present hypothesized that at some point there was a kind of population bottleneck that right, all Ashkenazi Jews descend from such a small number of people that were isolated in Eastern Europe, and that's why some diseases that happen to be among those genes, in fact, became magnified as that population grew. And now we're starting to see that, in fact, that population bottleneck might have happened much earlier, that there was greater diversity, and that maybe there were a series of bottlenecks or a series of events during which, right, Ashkenazi Jews maybe got smaller, then grew again, got smaller, then grew again. And which in a way, again, I think conforms better to the written records than those early theories that hypothesized one bottleneck and one small group from which everybody else descended.
This is, I keep saying it, but this is all just so incredibly fascinating. So my understanding, and this is what we've talked about in the story of us over these months that we've all been together, is that we actually see pretty significant intermarriage, cultural mixing, genetic mixing, whatever language we're going to use, throughout most of Jewish history before the rise of Ashkenazi Jewry, call it 1,000 years ago. Is that, you think, a correct read? I'd always understood, for instance, that we saw massive either intermarriage or conversion or some combination of the two from within the Roman Empire and joining the Jewish people, and would have imagined that to have been true in all of the historical moments before that. Would you say that that's a fair statement, a fair framing, or are there things challenging that view?
I think it's probably fair to say that. I also think the isolation, I think, is partly self-imposed, and to the extent that, right, rabbis promoted intermarriage and so on, and they probably did it, right, among other Jewish groups as well. But I think in addition, in Europe, I think the circumstances of Jewish life were very difficult, right, where Jews had to live in certain neighborhoods after the 16th century. They often had to live in ghettos. There were a series of expulsion that forced them to go. And so I think it's a combination of right, Jewish law and probably historical circumstances. But again, now that we can look at ancient DNA, it does show more of a diversity than previously thought, and that we don't truly understand. So I think, it's not incorrect, but I also think that certainly there's more space for what happens in Erfurt, right? A small Jewish town in Germany where you have genetically at least, it seems, 2, 3, 4 different group of Jews, some coming from Eastern Europe, and their, right, genetic markers are different from those that resemble more populations in Western Europe. Some resemble more populations in Turkey. And so, I think it's certainly correct to an extent, because otherwise we wouldn't understand how today genetically Ashkenazi Jews are also similar. But at the same time, now that we can look in the past, there are more questions that are arising about how this happened. And is it really only intermarriage, or is it also history or other biological processes that we don't fully understand yet?
So I was hoping to go back a little bit to a reference you made earlier to the Khuzaris. And we talked about them a few weeks ago. And in a week or two, we're going to look at Yehuda Halevi's work, the Khuzari, of course, and talk about that. But I was struck reading your piece that the Khuzari history, mythology has always been political. And it's, of course, highly political at this moment as well, when accusations of Ashkenazi Jews being Khuzari are often leveled as a way of suggesting that we are real Jews that go back to the Middle East, as if our tribal boundaries don't work for us. But one of the takeaways I also had from your work was to think that maybe there is more reality to some level of Khuzari influence, ethnicity, history than I had given credit for a couple weeks ago when I was teaching it, when I dismissed it as mostly mythology of senior leaders who had converted, and then later Jews in further west in Europe who are using this as sort of a King Arthur story for them. Or so we'd just love to hear any theories that you have, or how this is changing and upending how we think of ourselves, and if you have any thoughts on the political ramifications too, but that can be separate.
That's a minefield, right? It's interesting because the way these genetic identifications work, the way 23andMe works, is that they have created, and not just 23andMe, all the companies like 23andMe and scientists working with them, when they started studying present DNA, they basically realized it's an enormous library, right, with trillions of letters, A, T, C, and G in sequences that we really don't understand. And so they started making sense of those sequences of DNA by comparing them to the DNA of known groups in the present. So they went to Ashkenazi Jews, and they looked at their DNA and looked at the markers, and then they went to other small populations, right? Basques and Finns and different groups in India. And so that's how they started building these reference libraries of different populations. So when you give a swab to 23andMe, what they'll do is they'll compare it to those different groups. And if it looks like any of those groups, they will tell you, well, you have 22% of Chinese ancestry or Asian ancestry or Black ancestry. And people are always surprised, right, to learn that, wait a second, how can I have so much ancestry from Africa or something like that? But I mean, at some point we all came from Africa, of course. So the thing is, there's no group today that are the Khazars, right? So we don't know what Khuzari DNA would have looked like. So those who've done those studies have typically assumed that, well, this group in the Caucasus, most likely they are the Khazars, or they've looked at a whole series of different groups of people who live in the Caucasus today. And then from there, they hypothesized that 1,000 years ago, right, they might have been the Khazars. And so I think what's happened is that when scientists decided, well, it must be this or that group, they maybe didn't always find correspondences with Ashkenazi Jews. But I think when they've done studies and they've said, oh, we're going to look at everybody in the Caucasus, well, then they started finding similarities, right? Which suggests that are all Ashkenazi Jews descending from the Khazars? I can't answer that question. is there common DNA between people from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus region, and Ashkenazi Jews? It appears there is. There is also from the Middle East, right? Typically, when people have looked and compared, they've found half European DNA and half Middle Eastern DNA. But of course, the caveat is again that this is present day DNA that we're comparing to, right? If we could go and find the graves of the Khazari kings and compare, well, then we start talking, right? If we could go back to Alexandria 2,500 years ago and open a Jewish cemetery that, right, would still be there and look at those remains, well, then we'd have a lot of very interesting information that is actually historical, right? So now what we're doing, we're comparing to present day DNA and making inferences because, and I guess, right, this relates to the class, which, as I understand, is the story of us. Human beings are interested in their history, right? You want to know where we are and where we come from, who we are and where we come from, and what our origins are. And we know that DNA gets copied every generation. So we know that our DNA contains the DNA of our ancestors too. And so we think, right, if we compare it and we see that it has the same as all these different groups, then at some point, all of those people were part of our ancestry. And what ancient DNA is starting to show is that those ancient groups, they actually were much more mixed than, right, we think they were. And so that is the complication here, is that what I suspect, right, if we could go to Jerusalem and Alexandria and all those places where we know there were ancient Jewish communities, and right, Baghdad and open graves and look, we would actually be surprised at what we would find. And the idea that there was at some point a pure, Jewish group that left the Middle East and mixed with all these other populations and became, less pure, or right, I don't want to use those words, but you see the idea. I think if we could really go, if we really had access to all these ancient remains, we'd be surprised. We'd find that probably ancient Jewish DNA from Jerusalem might be mixed with all kinds of groups who lived there at the time, and some we know and some we don't know anymore. And that is what's interesting about history. And I think ultimately, our identity is more shaped by the places we live today, our culture. Talking about right, the current conflict, when people are trying to say, right, Jews go back to Europe, you're all from Europe, you don't belong to the Middle East. I don't know that, right, our genes are really the answer here. Eventually, right, all of us at some point came from Africa, so are we going to go and say, hey, look at my genes, I can live in, Cape Town because it's really beautiful and I love it, right? So I suspect it's an argument and we fall into it because there's a really brutal and difficult conflict going on, and so we want to defend against it. But I don't really think that, let me put it this way. I definitely think Israel has a right to exist, and I think Jews have a legitimate right to have a country in, their biblical Holy Land. But I think culture and religion and the UN vote and the fact that, right, people built a country there probably is a more solid basis for legitimacy than DNA. But that's me.
So one of the themes we've come back to again and again in Story of Us is rejecting the idea that there is some original text that we can go back to, that there's some pure original version of the Torah or the precursors or whatever that looks like. And instead we have framed the idea that every generation is always retelling these stories in their own image. And it was really startling to me listening to you and reading your work to see just how true that seems to be of Jewish genomes as well, that there is no original. So with that in mind, I was hoping you might say a little bit about what we should and shouldn't take away from, when we spit in the thing and mail it off to 23andMe. So for instance, in our family, I did that and was told I was 97% Ashkenazi Jewish until about a year later, they came back and changed it and said, actually, you're 100%. The diversity we thought you had, we've changed your mind. But the other piece that showed up on my 23andMe, that's always sort of been interesting, at least within our family, is we had a family tradition on my dad's side that we were Kohens. And we looked at the paternal haplotype that showed up in 23andMe, and it's the Kohen paternal haplotype, even as many people who are not Jewish and not Kohens share that haplotype. What are the boundaries of what we should be deriving from information like this, and what are the things that are going too far that we're assuming about ourselves or our history or our story that these tests really aren't telling us? Maybe that was too open-ended of a question, but
Well, I mean, it is a big question. I'm not sure I can tell anyone what, they should or shouldn't, right, understand or derive from those tests. I mean, I think I think it's for every person to decide for themselves. I, for me personally, when I started reading those books, what was very eye-opening and refreshing to me was the realization of how much we take current ideas about race, about nation, about religion or belonging, and we want to find it in our biology, and we want to project it back onto the past. And every time we've actually had access to ancient DNA, the results have been surprising, right? I mean, we didn't know that, for example, most Europeans have Neanderthal DNA. The story was always, right, the Neanderthals were there and the Homo sapiens came and they killed them all. And now we know there is actually quite a fair bit of mixing even there, because there's no other explanation for the amount of Neanderthal DNA that they found in so many populations after we were able to look at Neanderthal DNA and things like that. And so I think maybe to be less rigid about those things, right? Because we, the nations that we know today, right? We think, do I have French DNA? Do I have, German DNA or whatever? I mean, those nations are concepts that emerged in, the 19th century. We don't know that in 1500, 1200 or 1000 or 800 people felt French or German or Austrian the way that they might feel today. So what does it mean when we look at this DNA and we say, oh, it is proof that I am this or that I am that? And so I think we have an opportunity here to be maybe less rigid and more understanding of the story of humanity. Is just a story of how much people moved around, if you think about it, and maybe it's even magnified within Jewish people, right? But these ancient people coming out of Africa, coming back, going through the entire Middle East, going as far as the Americas, Asia. I mean, it's really a story of moving and migration, and there was probably always much more mixing than we thought. So I guess, yeah, that's what I would say.
So sorry, I think I went out of focus. Over the last however many years, call it 50 years in the United States, there have been millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars poured into efforts to promote Jewish endogamy, to get Jews to marry other Jews. In some ways, it has been the biggest communal effort of the Jewish community over these last however many decades, including, of course, birthright, which many people understand as a sort of pro-Israel Hasbara, but really is actually their main goal is American Jewish endogamy in marriage. So that goes along with the reality that Ashkenazi Jews in the United States are amongst the most intermarrying groups in the country, whether you count us as an ethnicity or as a religious group. We are right up there on the highest of intermarriage rates. So in some ways, is it fair to say that actually the endogamy and stability of the Ashkenazi genome over the last 1,000 years is the exception to Jewish history rather than the rule?
We are paying a price for it, right? In terms of variants and diseases that get transmitted generation after generation. I suppose to the extent of how I think isolated Ashkenazi Jews were at some point in Eastern Europe, and that created that bottleneck. But I think if you're looking, for example, at Sephardic, Mizrahi Jews, in that same period, they live in an area that goes from Spain to Iraq, right? Where, I mean, you have different countries, but they speak Arabic. It's sort of this extended, right? I mean, Spain until 1492. This is this extended Muslim world in which, people can move around, and so I think, I don't think there are the same. I don't think there are the same markers for Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews that we find in the DNA of Ashkenazi Jews. Whether it's because of less intermarriage or because just the community was much bigger and people could move around more, or that there hadn't been at some point or at several points in history this kind of crisis where the community became very small and the sort of whatever mutation or variance stayed in. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think you're right in your characterization of endogamy today and probably the past 200-300 years. Was there so much less of it in other Jewish populations, or were the circumstances different? And so they don't pay the same price in terms of health ramification and some genetic diseases that are caused by one variant in these billions of genes. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. I think you're correct, but at the same time, I'm not sure if it says something about those bottlenecks and the circumstances. Because my understanding is that there actually was a lot of endogamy also, I think, maybe not as much, maybe not as much, or maybe, those areas were larger, and so there were more opportunities for mixing and exchanges and so on. But I definitely think that it is much higher, I think, in Ashkenazi Jewish communities.
Or perhaps also we might see higher rates of conversion historically in some of these other communities as opposed.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I want to open this up for questions from folks who are on here. I wrote this in the chat, but if you are on the Zoom and would like to ask a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A or into the chat, please. And if you're watching this on the stream, I am monitoring that chat as well, so drop that in. So from Miriam Roden, people have a tendency to associate physical appearances with DNA, sort of. We do tend to look like our parents. My maternal grandfather's grandmother looked unmistakably Asian from the Baltics, Finno-Ugrian, which you can trace across the Arctic. But one of our regulars brought up that in the time of the Khazars, the Mongols were coming. I'm not sure I see a question there, but very interesting, Miriam. Flora, anything to say to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. I think,
It's
yeah, we look like our.
It's an agreement.
Oh, okay,
I
okay.
think I think we're a whole lot more mixed up than we think.
Other questions from folks? Feel free to unmute yourself too if you'd like.
I have a quick question. It's Paul. I'm sorry. I was trying to type it, but it's too long of a question.
No, you're good, Paul. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't know if this is really part of it. Other than the differences of DNA, some of the, what do you call it? Other traits such as music, the food, and everything. What really is the difference between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi, being I'm Ashkenazi? But yet my cousin, I know this is crazy, she is Sephardic. But we all believe in the same Jewry, don't we?
Well, and I think what was interesting in that cemetery in Erfurt was that it did show a mixture of Jews coming from Turkey and from Southern Europe, which are typically the more Sephardic areas. So suggesting that right there too, there was there was maybe more mixing than what we thought. I think the main difference, and I think that's where Rabbi Bogard is right about pointing out the really high rates of endogamy in recent history, is to get a result that says you're 100% Ashkenazi, or and the rates of genetic diseases. I mean, I remember excuse me. Yeah, of Ashkenazi disease. I remember when I got pregnant with my first child, and I went to the doctor, and he asked me, "Oh, are you Ashkenazi?" And I said yes. And then I had to do additional blood tests because there's a much higher chance of all kinds of diseases there. So there's no equivalent in other Jewish groups, right? If you look at Mizrahi Jews, if you look at Sephardic Jews, they don't have the same rates. Now, there's also a factor of who gets studied. I think because Ashkenazi Jews moved to America and many became doctors and scientists, and so they studied themselves. And then the same happened in Israel, where the first Zionists who moved to the Yishuv before the creation of the state, and then became sort of the leading class in the state, they were from Europe and they were Ashkenazi, and so they became interested in who they are, and they studied themselves too, and so again, I think we might learn more as we start studying different groups or have access to ancient DNA, which often is difficult because Jewish law prohibits opening graves and doing. They could do it in Norwich because they didn't know the people in the well were Jewish, right? They found 6 bodies in a well, and they didn't know who it was. And I think in Erfurt they received permission to just look at teeth or something like that. The local rabbi gave permission. But so this is all ongoing.
So looking at your research and all of these studies and thinking of all of its implications for how we understand ourselves and our past, I've also been struck by the ways that traditional halakha has been mostly uninterested in DNA studies. Right, you can't use DNA evidence, for instance, to prove paternity when it comes to mamzerim in many Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting to see how different this is, that we have genetic origin coming up against our understanding of ourselves, which is really a social construct and always has been a social construct, and one that changes through time. So we have a whole bunch more questions here. Nancy Lutz says she's heard that celiac disease is twice as common amongst Ashkenazi Jews as the general population. I have celiac disease also. Is this a result of endogamy?
I mean, it's a result of, what they call these bottlenecks, where you had a very small population, and probably there were some mutations among those people, and then endogamy, right? Then they intermarried, and so that mutation stayed generation after generation. So yeah, that's what I said. I think we paid a price for that. Some people say that some of these genes, protected against other things, right? That I don't remember them. One disease, and apparently people who have it have lesser rates of tuberculosis, and so there's some speculation about that. Why some of these genes stayed within those populations, but not being a scientist, I don't. I can't explain all of it.
Sickle cell carriers have increased resistance to malaria.
Right, exactly. So that's one of the speculations for why these remained, these variants, right, remained or stayed.
That was Dr. Ray Slavin, by the way, we heard from there. So a question from Shlomo. Has there been any DNA testing with any of the graves found around Qumran? Or has there been any DNA testing on, we've got now evidence from Jews 1,000 years ago. Anything from 1,000 years before that?
I haven't seen it yet, but I think I know they want to do it, right? So if they have access to remains and they're not too degraded, but I think the technology is becoming so good that they sometimes can use a teeth or a bone from someone's finger is enough. But I think they're also trying to get permission from rabbinic authorities in Israel to do this kind of investigation. So I haven't seen it yet. I suspect people want to do it, and there's maybe people who are nervous about what it could show.
Of course, the political ramifications of it.
Right. But again, I think the political, because it's part of the debate, the political ramifications are there, but in a way it shouldn't. It should be about, for me at least, what interests me is to know how Jewish people lived in the past and what they did and what their lives were like. And I don't see what I do as winning political arguments today. But yeah, a lot of people think it is.
Other questions? While we're waiting for more questions, my other question that's been sitting there with me is, and I think it was a reference to this that had made you send me the article. I had heard some story, I don't even remember where I read this anymore, that 1,000 years ago or so, the bottleneck narrowed down to 4 women in Ashkenaz, that they could narrow down, forgetting the numbers, 80% of all Ashkenazi Jews to these 4 women, or whatever this was. Could you tell us a little bit about this and whether that holds any water? Or there's something so romantic about this notion of 4 also, right, with the imahot and
right. And maybe that's why, again, I'm not a scientist, and I think the way they do these studies, I mean, this was a study based on current day DNA, is they're sort of hypothesizing, if we find all these different mutations today, they must have come that many generations ago, and so on. And they also can look at different sequences of DNA, and if they have many mutations, they probably came from a long time ago. If they have fewer mutations, they're more recent. And so this is how they did it. This is where I, as a historian, was always confused, because I always felt, when were there just 4 women, 4 Jewish women living in Europe, right? Who would they be, and what happened to all the other women, and why didn't their DNA make it in? Sort of, these are the things that to me never fully made sense, because we don't have exact numbers for, you know, who lived. But for example, we know that during the First Crusade, so we're talking 1096, right, when the communities of Worms and Speyer and so on are destroyed, there's a few thousand Jews who lived there. And you know, these are the earliest Ashkenazi Jewish communities, and who are these 4 women, and what happened to all the others? And these are the things that I personally never understood, because I used text, and the DNA evidence just didn't jibe with it. So yeah, I guess it's a nice story. I just don't understand how it works historically. What happened to all the other women and their descendants? I mean, were they all massacred? Did they all convert and cease being Jewish? Or, you know, there's nothing in our text that I guess explains it. At the same time, I'm not a scientist, so I can't say it's all wrong, but I just never understood it.
So last question, and thank you for being with us. And this is so speculative, feel free to entirely reject it. But next week, we're going to be looking at Rashi. Rashi, the figure, Rashi, the work. And in particular, we're going to be looking at Rashi less as a creator of his commentary and more as an anthologizer of Jewish thought up until that point. If we could sequence Rashi's DNA, what do you think it would show?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. You know, he's one of the earliest, right? He's one of those first generations of Jews in, you know, Eastern France, Western Germany, what we call early Ashkenaz. That's where all Ashkenazi Jews come from. But he's one of the first ones. I mean, he's I don't know. He certainly, right, tried to. He worked within the community, right? Those who have studied his commentary have shown how it was really a matter of adapting and explaining. He's using some of the earliest French words. I mean, no, he's writing, right? The earliest French words that we have in writing are in Rashi's scripts, in his commentary, because at the time, everyone who wrote in Latin. And so we know that French was the spoken language. So it was very much integrated in that medieval French community. Would it show, you know, 100% Middle East or Southern Europe, or maybe a mixture of Northern European DNA too? It would be interesting if we could do that.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I mean, really, so much. This added an incredible amount both to where we're at in history right now, and I think spoke to much of what we've been trying to talk about throughout this last 6-month journey we've been on. Any closing thoughts for us, or any big pieces we haven't talked about that you'd like to? There's also a request in the chat. Folks want to know where they might be able to read this article of yours.
So the article is not published yet. You're the first one. You're the first one to hear about it. It was just accepted actually in the Jewish Quarterly Review. I think it will be published sometime next year, because academic publishing is slow. I'm happy to send you a copy too, if you're interested. But so yeah, it will be published, I think, I'm guessing spring 2025. So if you want a copy before, I can send it to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for making this time. Thank you
Thank you
for
for having me. This was a pleasure.
sharing your Torah with us. Helene Frankel says, wow, those four women must have been busy.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, they were very busy.
very busy. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back together next week for a regular story of us. And I feel confident in saying that everyone here appreciated you being here as much as I did. So truly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.